Remember, remember the 5th of November. Gunpowder, treason and plot. Hello and welcome back to Archaeology Soup Towers on the 5th of November, and part of a slightly extended Halloween month this year, in so much as October didn't quite go according to plan away from the camera, and that left me not quite able to deliver, particularly on the history of clowns video that I really wanted to do this year. So that's coming next week, and this week I had hoped to talk to Alexandra Morton Hayward about zombies and ancient brains, but calendars clashed and sadly she wasn't available. Maybe next year, fingers crossed, fingers crossed. But it occurred to me a couple of days ago that this Friday, today, is the 5th of November, Bonfire Night, or Guy Fawkes Night, as some people call it. And it has a very interesting history, and I think a very interesting place in modern life as a sort of state-sanctioned form of sympathetic magic. But in order to understand that, we need to look a little bit at the history of Bonfire Night, of Guy Fawkes Night, and sort of pull apart some of the connotations that came to be associated with this holiday that was created at the beginning of the 1600s. It was set up to celebrate the failure of Guy Fawkes and his co-conspirators' plot to explode Parliament in 1605, killing the political class of England, and also, of course, the monarch, James I, was at risk of being exploded too. And so when these guys were caught and Guido was tortured, famously to the point where he could barely sign his own name on documents of confession, the story surrounding the Catholic conspiracy became very, very popular within the country, and people rushed to celebrate the failure and the preservation, I suppose, more to the point, of this Protestant, relatively newly Protestant nation and its bright new future, all that kind of stuff, with a rearrangement of some older holiday traditions. Being a relatively puritanical nation in the early 1600s, England had lost some of its sort of merry old England traditions that had roots back into, in some cases, prehistory, when it came to various holidays and revelry and drunkenness and public songs and all this kind of thing. And so this was a chance to maybe take some of the bonfires that had previously been associated with All Hallows Eve and Halloween and Samhain, and manoeuvre them just a few days along in the calendar to November the 5th, and have them used to celebrate the continuation of a nation. You see, on the 23rd of January 1606, just a couple of months after the plot to explode the House of Parliament had been revealed, Parliament enacted a new law, the Observance of the 5th of November Act. This stipulated that ministers across the country were compelled to hold a service of thanksgiving on the 5th of November, where the Act in full would be read aloud, in order to celebrate the continuation of Parliament and the Protestant monarch on the throne. People attending the service were expected to remain sober throughout festivities and to be suitably well behaved in their demeanour. This was a puritanical festival after all. But nonetheless, certain aspects of older turning of the season, autumn into winter sort of festivals like Samhain or All Hallows Eve made their way into this new state-sanctioned holiday on the 5th of November, namely bonfires. Now, initially, bonfires weren't used to burn effigies of, for example, Guy Fawkes, but the holiday had its roots in anti-Catholic sentiment, and this saw new fervour in 1625, when King James's son, the future Charles I, married, shock horror, a Catholic woman, namely Henrietta Maria of France. It's fair to say that the Protestant response to this was less than favourable. New common prayers were issued, uniting Protestant folks under a reminder that rebellion against the Protestant monarch and the throne was evil. as was Catholicism in general. And it's around this time that bonfires came to be used as a means of igniting and burning effigies of figures such as the Pope, certain bishops perhaps, or indeed Satan himself, which for some people was akin to burning the Pope and vice versa. This anti-Catholic fervour would go in and out of fashion as the 17th century proceeded into the 18th century, and it might at some point become politically inconvenient to hate on the Catholics when people higher up the social food chain, aristocrats and royalty, had married outside the Protestant faith. Attitudes were shifting, and bit by bit, gradually, we're not quite sure exactly when, but certainly over that time, the focus on a gunpowder treason day, as it was called, and the evil Catholic plot shifted towards something called Guy Fawkes Day, and a particular figure at the heart of that plot, an Englishman who had betrayed his country as opposed to necessarily being a state-mandated festival that hated Catholicism in general. Indeed, by 1790, the Times newspaper was reporting on children who were begging in the streets for money for a guy. The famous phrase, "penny for a guy," came into being at the end of the 18th century. A report on the 4th of November 1802 described a set of idle fellows with some horrid figure dressed up as Guy Fawkes. They were convicted of begging and receiving money and committed to prison as idle and disorderly persons. And it's around this time that actually this tension between the haves and the have-nots was gathering pace. In the 19th century, increasing mechanization of farming practices, for example, meant that people were losing their jobs, people were becoming poorer, and the response to that was often acts of violence, burning of warehouses and machinery, and indeed even workhouses where people might end up having to work if they'd lost their jobs. Around this time of social upheaval, Guy Fawkes Day gained another name, Bonfire Night, and it was in 1831 that the diarist Mary Frampton feared that Bonfire Night might erupt into more violence. Various rumours spread of intended mischief on this night, but all passed quietly. The only difference was that no stuffed Guy Fawkes were brought to our door, as was the common custom of the day, and that the fireworks were more prolonged, lasting from dark until near midnight. Apprehensions had been entertained of riots, and the guard at the jail was increased, and a day or two previously special constables had been sworn in and organised for the town, ready to be called upon if required. All, however, passed off quietly. Around 1850, the Pope reinstated Catholic hierarchy in England, and this saw renewed interest in the meaning of November the 5th. That year, the holiday saw burnings of effigies of the new Catholic Archbishop of Westminster, Nicholas Wiseman, and, of course, the Pope. In all, 14 effigies of Catholics and the devil were marched across from the Strand over Westminster Bridge to Southwark, where they were burned, and across London there were loud protests against Catholicism. This led, 9 years later, in 1859, to the repealment of the observance of the 5th of November Act. It was no longer a state-mandated holiday, and it was hoped that this would simmer down religious tensions. But, to a certain extent, the echo of this state focus on Catholicism continued. In 1998, an editorial in the Catholic Herald called for an end to Bonfire Night nationally, describing it as an offensive act that stokes anti-Catholic sentiment and rhetoric across the country. And though, from my experience, I would say that most UK citizens today don't think of Bonfire Night as an anti-religious or anti-Catholic festival, it's always been a holiday that focuses the national narrative and attention on specific issues. Hate the Catholics. Don't hate the Catholics too much. What about Guy Fawkes? Hate him instead. Or indeed, from within, working classes themselves using the holiday as a moment to focus protest, for example, against the mechanisation of farming. This tradition has continued. These moments of focused ire, I suppose, on particular figures continue in the form of effigies that we might see burned in more recent years. Political figures, for example, former prime ministers, former presidents, figures of public fun and ridicule. This focus, this ability to have people gather and watch the burning of a particular visage or personage, a person represented by the guy on the fire, is actually, potentially, an act of communal sympathetic magic that has its roots in a state-sanctioned holiday. I actually have a definition here of sympathetic magic from Wikipedia. Yep, it's a real website. Sympathetic magic is a magical modality that involves symbolically imitating the desired outcome. It may involve acting on a physical representation of a target, for example, a voodoo doll, this kind of thing we see often, for example, in films and entertainment, or creating a physical representation of the outcome, or recreating the desired outcome through motion and art. For example, the burning of an effigy of a figure of revilement or ridicule. And this thought popped into my head a few days ago, and I simply had to explore it in some way. So here we are today in this video. This national holiday that was created through an Act of Parliament in 1606, the observance of the 5th of November Act, that became Gunpowder Treason Day, a focus for anti-Catholic sentiment, that shifted into Guy Fawkes Day, a focus of anti-treacherous sentiment, a subtle shift that was more politically expedient, that became Bonfire Night, a focus for more generalised protest, for example, against the mechanization of farming and other anti-establishment sentiments. Throughout the history of the holiday, there's been this attempt to encourage people to celebrate the continuation of the state, but to control how they celebrate. At times, for example, fireworks and bonfires have been banned linked with the holiday, but they always come back, and today they are used to burn things that we still ridicule and focus on as figures of, at the very least, frustration, as I say, if not downright hatred. These things describe sympathetic magical invocation, and I'm fascinated by that. As an anthropologist, if this was happening elsewhere in the world, if this was happening in a country, for example, that didn't speak English, we would absolutely identify this as pseudo-magical, at the very least, if not downright magical invocation. Here, we sort of think about it as something a bit more maybe politically laden. We think about it as a yay, Parliament wasn't exploded, wasn't blown up. But that's not actually what we're doing when we are burning particular figures at the stake, I suppose, figuratively speaking, but on the bonfire. If it's just Guy Fawkes, fair enough, that makes perfect sense, and it's in the spirit of the holiday. But these other figures as well fascinate me. And of course, the resurgence of Guy Fawkes, for example, in the V for Vendetta graphic novel in the 1980s that we saw in movie form, not that, well, increasingly long ago, but nonetheless, a film that was made, again, about this tension between the working class, the underclass, I suppose, the commoner, and people with political and state power. It's seemingly expressing something that's always simmering beneath the surface in society, and possibly with the wrong spark might literally explode like a firework. I suppose perhaps as much as this could be seen as an act of communal sympathetic magic, it's also a pressure release valve, allowing a sort of a national socio-political moment of pathos, celebration of the continuation of government, perhaps, but also something else is expressed that in another time or another place might have led to revolution, downright rebellion against the crown, for example. These are interesting ideas, and I figured seeing as this week I couldn't record with Alexandra and explore zombies and brains for you, that I would sort of lay out this little, I suppose, video essay, this slight stream of consciousness that I've just been reflecting on for the past few days, and it fascinates me. What do you guys think? Especially if you're observing Bonfire Night and Guy Fawkes Night from outside the UK. What do you think of this 400-year-old tradition? What does it look like to you? And if you are from the UK, have you ever thought about it like this? Have you ever wondered why it is that we're burning this particular, figure of the day on top of the fire? Have you ever thought about it beyond being a celebration that Parliament persisted? And maybe some of these other connotations that we've thought about today. Let me know, comment below. I'm really interested to hear what you think. Thank you for watching. Until next time, do take care. Bye bye.